Slate.
rolling camera. Somebody get in there with the.
Slate. So we got this information.
Now we got our little lawn into.
I don't hear it. Let me think.
It's way in the background.
I don't hear it. It's not that bad.
I mean, it's over here.
Yeah, I don't hear it from this.
They'll be gone soon. You can't beat these leaves.
I was going to say, they blow them from one side of the street to the other.
Yeah, let's put this later, please. Take one. No, he says,
There's no code on it.
there's no code.
Oh, there's no code. You
Yes,
just,
but
okay.
the code is on the camera.
All the way in, all the way in, all the way in. Up a little bit, a bit more in. Okay, and. All right, we're rolling, guys.
Bill
Okay.
Campbell, take one. Okay. Thank you again, Mayor, for consenting to do this interview. So this weekend, I'm asking everyone before we start any deep questions, an anecdote about Maynard Jackson. Tell us an anecdote, something humorous, something funny, something tragic about Maynard Jackson, some story you remember.
Maynard was a character in so many ways, gregarious, eloquent, but he's also very funny unintentionally. We went to dinner one night and went to a steakhouse, and I'd never been out socially with Maynard, and of course he began by greeting every single waiter, every busboy, each and every person, which I learned from that experience just how important it was to acknowledge everyone, and that was his special gift. So in any event, we were sitting at the table, and Maynard orders, and Maynard was a large man, both in style and substance, but in girth. So Maynard began his order. He said, "I'd like an appetizer, I'd like a salad, I'd like a large steak, potato with everything on it, and a Diet Coke." I thought it was hilarious. But in any event, that was Maynard, a man of many contradictions, but a man who really lived his life in the largest way possible.
Great. So tell us about how you first got to know Maynard Jackson. How did that relationship develop?
Like many expatriates from Atlanta, I moved here because of him. It was the aura of black political and economic, social, cultural power that Atlanta represented, in large part because of Maynard Jackson. People now take for granted Atlanta's extraordinary place in black America. But Maynard Jackson, along with the Atlanta University Center and the Civil Rights Movement, those three things really created modern Atlanta as we know it. So I was living in North Carolina. I was in law school, Duke, and I saw Atlanta as this land of great promise for African Americans. And Maynard Jackson represented it. He was smooth and eloquent and bombastic, but he was also a man of great substance about issues that were important to me and really important to this country. So there was really no other choice about where I wanted to live. I wanted to live where Maynard Jackson ruled a city like Atlanta. So I moved here out of law school, met Maynard Jackson soon after I came here, and was enchanted with him as everyone else who met him instantly. You knew this was an extraordinary human being, and that sense of being in the presence of someone that's extraordinary. And I've met many extraordinary people in my life. Nelson Mandela, Mother Teresa, John Lewis, Andy Young, and Maynard Jackson was in that same pantheon of people who really represented someone extraordinary.
And what year was that when you came to Atlanta?
I came to Atlanta as a summer clerk with a law firm in 1976. Maynard was elected in 1973, so this is during his first term. And I know we're going to have to reshoot that.
So open the door.
you have a second one of these real quick? Thanks, I'm sorry, son is creeping in.
You want to cut?
No, just 2 seconds.
Look at that anecdote. Right.
Hilarious.
That's funny, the Diet Coke after the just.
Any idea one more sound?
Like 40-ounce
Say
steak.
that again?
It was
One
in
more
a
sound
Diet
after
Coke.
that.
Hilarious.
Add one more sound like it if you want to make a big flag.
Okay, no, this
So
is
you
this is
came
fine.
in, he was going into
Thanks.
his second term.
No, when I came, Maynard was ending his first term, and was
Okay, let's start. Everybody settle, please. So again, tell us what year you came and what Maynard was.
I came to Atlanta in the summer of 1976 as a law clerk for a very large law firm, and met Maynard Jackson soon after arriving. It was an incredible time for Atlanta because Jimmy Carter was running for president, and there was so much of the body politic that was going on both in Atlanta but also throughout the country because of the focus on Atlanta and President Carter. And I had the opportunity to meet Maynard Jackson soon after I arrived and thought it was just an incredible opportunity for me to learn from this gifted politician, statesman, humanitarian, and it was one of the great moments of my life, and I continue to remember it as if it was yesterday.
So when did you start to get involved with city politics?
I've been involved in politics my entire life. I grew up in politics in Raleigh, North Carolina. My father was the president of the NAACP from 1958 until 1966. And North Carolina had the largest Ku Klux Klan population in the country. In fact, the Grand Dragon of the Klan was located in North Carolina. And frequently we would march every day from Shaw University, where SNCC was formed, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was formed in 1960 at Shaw University, where my grandmother graduated from Shaw in 1919. And so we would march with the students up and down the streets of Raleigh, while the Klan would march on the other side of the street in full robe regalia. So I've been involved in politics my entire life. My father believed that education and politics were the two most essential ways that you could change yourself and change your community. So from the time I was 5 or 6 years old, my father would take me to a precinct on election day, give me a little bag lunch, a lot of pamphlets, hand out those all day, come back at lunch, check on me, come back when the polls closed. So it really was a lifelong avocation.
I'm chasing this song.
Okay.
Yeah, 2 seconds.
Did you integrate the first public schools?
Yes, in North Carolina, 1960.
That must have been some experience.
It was a remarkable experience.
Talk about that. Talk about integrating. Let's are we ready?
Something going on sound.
There's a coffee. Were you hearing that, Mike? The coffee?
Not, his voice is
Okay,
Let's keep going. Come on.
still,
if we could stop it, it would.
Are we ready, guys?
He's checking the coffee machine.
Somebody's checking it now?
okay.
How about that? And then now you got Klan celebrating up there now.
That's amazing.
So, Bill, tell us about you as a young man integrating the first public school in North Carolina.
My parents were civil rights pioneers, and it was a very difficult time in 1960. And my parents applied for me and my older brother and sister to integrate the schools in Raleigh. And my older brother and sister were turned down, and I was accepted. So on September 7th, 1960, I integrated the schools of Raleigh, North Carolina in the second grade. It was a remarkable time, full of violence and threats, and we could not live in our home for many, many nights because of the bomb threats. And what's so interesting is that in those days, and there's sort of a interesting parallel, the people that we feared the most were the police, because most of the police were either Klansmen or Klan sympathizers. And so you never had a real feeling, even when you called the police to check the house for bombs, that you could be secure that they really had your best interest at heart. a very difficult time. I was the only black child there for 5 years in the elementary school, was beaten, spat upon. They canceled the PTA for several years. It was difficult, but necessary.
Wow, wow. So you've gone through this experience in North Carolina, and you come to Atlanta as a young man, and you get involved in Atlanta politics. What was your first role, specific job in the Atlanta, government?
I never had a first role in Atlanta's government until I ran for the city council in 1981. Maynard was term limited, so he was very involved in recruiting someone to follow him as mayor to preserve his legacy and also to make certain that Atlanta continued on the same course. And he eventually settled on Andrew Young, another incredible civil rights pioneer and who had just left as the ambassador to the United Nations. So imagine coming to Atlanta, hadn't been here but a few years. There was an open city council seat. I ran for it at the same time that Andrew Young, one of my civil rights heroes, was running for the position of mayor, and we were both elected at the same time.
That's great. So you're in the city council, and Maynard decides to come back and he runs as mayor in 1990, right?
Well, first, it's important to remember this seminal moment in the race in 1981 for mayor. There was a distinguished state senator, Sidney Marcus, who was running, and Andy Young was running. And so there were some African Americans who supported the white candidate in this race, even though the vast bulk supported Andy Young. So there was this speech that Maynard Jackson gave at the Hungry Club, the Butler Street YMCA, the Black YMCA, which had great significance for many, many years. And at this speech, this was the end of Maynard's term, and Maynard said, "I am appalled at these grinning and shuffling Negroes who would not support a person of such caliber as Andrew Young." And that phrase, grinning and shuffling Negroes, exploded across the airways and rippled through the communities, and suddenly there was this incredible ferocity that people understood what he said, what he meant, and it really just made such a tidal wave, a tsunami of emotions that came about as a result of this one very precise phrase, grinning and shuffling Negroes. And of course, it helped propel Andy Young on to victory in the election.
Now, weren't there some backlash to that statement that he was doing the same thing that Sam Massell had done when he was running for mayor back against Sam Massell in the 70s?
I wasn't here during the Sam Massell election when there was fairly obvious racism in this "A City Too Young to Die" campaign by Sam Massell against Maynard Jackson. But the tidal wave of history just washed over Sam Massell, and Maynard was elected fairly easily, and that really played a very small role in the ascendancy of Atlanta as we know it. Maynard's comments were important because it really put into context the same thing that we've seen in Black history when W.B. Du Bois opposed the comments from Booker T. Washington about the 5 fingers on the hand speech. It is the same thing that flows through Black history, from the slaves who were trying to get away and those who were trying to keep them from leaving. And it's the same thing that's happened, past is prologue. So I think all of us really appreciated the comment. We understood what it meant. And even in today's world, we still know what that means in the proper context.
That's a good answer. So now Andy Young is mayor for 2 terms, and then Maynard decides to come back. What was what was happening in Atlanta when Maynard began his 3rd term as mayor? What was going on in the city and in the country?
Maynard's decision to come back was interesting. once he decided he was going to run for re-election, if you will, there was no doubt he would be elected. There was only this sort of odd question about why would you return given how successful you had been, and the fact that there was a real sense that what more can you do than you've already done in making Atlanta a great place? Well, Maynard had an answer for that, and it was helping to propel Atlanta towards the Olympic Games. And while the story that's told is really that Billy Payne, a very thoughtful white lawyer who came up with the concept and moved it forward, the real story is that Andy Young, with his international contacts, and Maynard Jackson as the mayor, were instrumental in getting the games coming to Atlanta. You know, for our entire life, people of color have been minimalized. And so the African vote was really, in a sense, not even understood as vital to the election of Atlanta over Athens, Greece, the sentimental favorite, by the way. But Maynard, with his larger-than-life persona, was so instrumental and so persuasive and just such a wonderful person to work with that we were able to squeak by, win the Olympic Games, and Maynard came back. And I guess most of his second iteration as mayor was really about getting Atlanta ready for the Olympic Games.
Right. But let's think about it now in terms of a larger historical perspective. I mean, we got our urban cities in the early 90s dealing with AIDS, dealing with cocaine, crack cocaine, dealing with homelessness. You know, a lot of this, as you know, there's white flight from some of these urban centers. I mean, this is a different city that Maynard was running now as mayor than he did the first two terms. How was he, I mean, you're on the city council still, right? Yes. How was he handling that stuff that was going on in the city?
When Maynard was elected for his third term in 1989, I was finishing up my second term as a city councilman. He asked me to be his floor leader on the city council. So I spent an incredible amount of time with him during those 4 years, and it was wonderful because I had a chance to really get to know him in a different way, in a more personal way, a more professional way, and we spent an awful lot of time together. I thought that his health issues, the difference in the tone of the country, which was then run by Ronald Reagan, there was just not the same sense of where Atlanta and urban America was going versus where the country wanted us to go. And I think Maynard really was frustrated in coming up against a lot of the hurdles that were inherent in a very conservative national government and a conservative nation, quite frankly, that just didn't see people of color or urban America in the same way that we had hoped our progress would lead us. So it was a very difficult time for those 4 years for Maynard, and I think it reflected in his not having the same kind of love for getting things done as he had previously when it was new and fresh and Atlanta was exploding across the landscape as the city on a hill. It was a different time.
This Monday we're going to interview Douglas Blackman, who used to work for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. You know, I know Doug pretty well, but I also know that between, I guess, 1990 and 1993, he was doing lots of articles about the Jackson, government and looking for corruption. And I know there was the Ira Jackson scandal. How did Maynard handle all this stuff that was swirling around him around that time?
Doug Blackman, who was a reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and has written a Pulitzer Prize winning book about slavery by another name, has had a lot of insight into what Maynard faced in those days. there was a sense that if you were an African American in a position of political power, there had to be something wrong with the way that you governed. If you a contract was awarded, there had to be something sinister about it. And I remember there was a case where Maynard made a statement which was, I am being accused of awarding contracts to African Americans who are my friends. Well, all the African Americans in Atlanta are my friends, so how could I not award a contract to someone who I would know because I've been mayor for so long? And I will never keep from awarding someone a contract just because I know them. And the ineluctable logic of that was just so persuasive that it sort of took the sting out of it, but didn't stop the inquisition no matter what. Maynard was very careful about the people that he surrounded himself with. He was scrupulously honest and always wanted to avoid even the appearance of impropriety, in large part because I think there was so much scrutiny on Maynard from the time he entered politics until his untimely death. But he found it to be, I think, very burdensome and difficult. And as I say, I knew Maynard during his first iteration, and then I had a chance to really work much more closely with him from 89 to 93, when we worked very closely together. And the differences were startling. He was ethereal and incredible during his first 8 years, and Atlanta rose with him. You know, the symbol of Atlanta is the phoenix bird, and you know, while there have been those critics who've said that our slogan, Atlanta, a city too busy to hate, will give us time. Nevertheless, Maynard was able to take Atlanta on his very broad shoulders with him to heights that were remarkable. In his second iteration in 89 to 93, I think Maynard found that the second time around, unlike Shalimar, may not be the best thing for everyone. He did a great job, but was burdened with higher expectations than he could deliver, a federal government that was hostile to urban America, and I think personal crises, health issues particularly, caused him not to enjoy it as much.
I was doing some research and I was reading about when the Rodney King verdict came through and what happened in lots of urban cities, and what happened here in Atlanta, and Maynard went out to try to talk to
Yes.
young black students. Tell us about what happened, if you remember.
I'm not so certain that, let me start again. In urban America, the Rodney King verdict and the Rodney King tape and the ensuing reaction to it all was a seminal moment for African Americans. And in many ways, it sort of gave us a roadmap to what was to come, unfortunately. Unfortunately for him, he wasn't beaten to death. But nevertheless, I think all of us were shocked, but not surprised, at the police brutality that was inflicted upon Rodney King. But what also was so surreal was that a jury, largely white suburban jury, could look at the videotape and not find these officers guilty of malfeasance. And so there was a electric jolt to the system. And much like in the riots in '68, there was just an explosion that had been pent up for a long time. The Reagan years, the law and order, the hostility to people of color, to urban America. And I think there was just something that could not be contained. All of us felt and still feel that Atlanta holds this special place in Black America. No place like it. Chris Rock in his documentary on hair began by saying, if you want to know what's going on in urban America, you go to Atlanta. And I think that's what most African Americans feel. So the relatively minor disturbance that came from students and others as a result of the verdict on the Rodney King, by most standards, was fairly minimal. But because there was some violence at all, it was shocking, because black people controlled all the levers of power except economic in Atlanta. The chief of police was African American, the judges were African American, the mayor was African American, the council members, every aspect of government. So there was a real sense that how could this reaction occur in Atlanta? But it did, and it was cathartic, because it showed that even in a place where there's been so much African American achievement, there was still many levels of poverty and frustration that bubbled over at what was clearly a verdict that shocked the conscience.
That's a good answer. But did you feel, did Maynard feel that, I mean, when he went out to talk to these young students, they didn't really pay attention to him, they didn't listen to him. Did he feel that now there was a disconnect, a generational disconnect?
Maynard was disappointed in the reaction, and Maynard went out to talk to the students, and there was respect for him, but there was also a sense that this was larger than Maynard could contain. And I think that byplay was difficult for him to absorb. But Maynard Jackson was always front and center, no matter what the occasion. When we had the missing and murdered children's crisis, the Jackson 5 gave a benefit concert. So I'm going back to his first time in office. They gave a benefit concert at the Omni, and 20,000 people had packed in to see Michael Jackson and his family. So there was a long delay. Anybody who's ever been to a black concert knows there's a long delay before the concert starts. And so after waiting a while, the announcer said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Jacksons." And Maynard and his family walked out on stage. And for a moment, there were several people that booed. But then there was this overwhelming, unbelievable response that just gave all of us an appreciation for how much people loved Maynard Jackson and his contributions to Atlanta. And I think you look at that and you look at him addressing the students, and you understand the arc of Maynard's life in Atlanta. No one has done more for Atlanta. No one has created the Atlanta that we know, and no one has loved Maynard more than Atlanta has loved this great man.
Good answer. We hearing that?
Very small, but it's there.
That's a good answer. Good answer. When you decided to run for mayor, did you immediately get Maynard's endorsement? And if you didn't, why not?
I was extremely close because I worked very closely with Maynard in the 4 years from 89 to 93, working as his floor leader, shepherding his legislation through the city council. And then one day in May of 1993, Maynard called me and said, "I need to come by and talk to you for a minute." Very odd. Never happened. As much as I delighted being around him and being with him, he was not sociable in that way. So he came to my house wearing sweat clothes, which is, again, different. Maynard was the most formal person ever. And if you saw him in something that was not a suit and tie, that was a special occasion. And so he came to my house and he sat down and he said, Bill, I've decided to not run for re-election. A thunderbolt. Unbelievable, because everyone in the world assumed that Maynard wanted the world stage when the Olympic Games came in 1996. And I was stunned. And he said, so I am telling you this first because I think that you can be the mayor of Atlanta, and I want you to know ahead of time. I'm going to make this announcement on Monday. So there wasn't an awful lot of lead time. But he said, I have great confidence that you can run and win, and that you will do things as I have done them in moving Atlanta forward. So from that moment on, Maynard was one of my biggest supporters. He manned the phones. He would come to our campaign office. He would give pep talks to our campaign volunteers. He would work the phones. And that was the great thing about Maynard. It was also something that my father would tell me when he was involved in politics, and that was, you need to be involved in every aspect. No one is too good to nail a sign down in the yard or to make a phone call to uncertain voters. Or to go out and pass out campaign literature. And that was the same way with Maynard. He believed that if you're the candidate, you do it all. And so he would sit with the other volunteers. It was just remarkable. Here's the man of great prominence and has been mayor for 12 years and really created Atlanta as we know it. And he would sit with the other volunteers and make these phone calls. And this is Maynard Holbrook Jackson. He never said Maynard Holbrook Jackson. And he would call these voters and talk to them and check it off, just like the other volunteers. It was one of the great moments watching Maynard involved in my campaign. In many ways, it was like my father had been reincarnated. My father died before I ran for mayor. So to see Maynard there was just a very special and wonderful moment for me.
So you guys are going to have a new mayoral election coming up soon, I guess, right?
Yes,
And I guess there are going to be some black candidates running. I've been told there are.
there always are.
Always are.
Yes.
I don't think the city of Atlanta has a power broker like Maynard who can say, anoint someone.
No.
Right? So when you decided to run for mayor, wasn't Mr. Arrington also one of the people who wanted to run for mayor too?
In the election of 1993, when I ran for mayor, there were a number of candidates who got in the race because Maynard created this a vacuum. When he was in office, no one else was going to be there. And when he left, no one knew what would happen thereafter. So there were a number of candidates. And largely in 93, there was Myrtle Davis, who was a very prominent city council person, and there was Michael Lomax, who was the chairman of the Fulton County Commission. They had a interesting relationship over the years. I think Michael Lomax and his wife had worked in Maynard's first administration. They were part of this sort of glorious uplift of Atlanta, and yet they had some difficult personal times. So Maynard working and endorsing me gave me a special cachet that others did not have. And then I also outworked everyone, which Maynard also told me, because I was not as well known. But it all worked out. I was elected. Everything went very smoothly. When I ran for re-election, Marvin Arrington, who was the longtime president of the city council, ran against me. And there was this radio debate. So Marvin Arrington was talking about the people that he had supporting him because he was from Atlanta. He always say he was born in Grady Hospital, knew 50,000 black people by the first name and so forth and so on. Bombastic fellow. And so he was talking about who he had endorsing him, and he said he had Hank Aaron supporting him, and I said, well, I've got Evander Holyfield supporting me, and I've got Maynard Jackson. And he said, Maynard Jackson, back during the Civil Rights Movement, he was passing. Now, to the uninformed, passing is the worst thing you can say about a black person, other than saying they're an Uncle Tom. And in fact, it may be worse than saying you're a grinning, shuffling Negro or an Uncle Tom all in the same stew, because passing means not only are you an Uncle Tom, but you're trying to pass yourself off as a white person and enjoy all the fruits of being white. And that's the worst thing you can say. So I said, what did you say? Are you accusing Maynard Jackson of passing? That's the most outrageous thing I've ever heard. You should be ashamed of yourself. You ought to apologize immediately. This is heresy. And of course, I knew that this was a dagger in his heart, and I was just taking it for everything. And this was like, this was Judas and every other historical figure I could think of. And so I said it all. And so before Jesus could get the news, right, Marvin Arrington put out a statement that said he was referring to Maynard passing out encyclopedias. So it was just this wonderful anecdote, and the aftermath was brutal for Marvin Arrington. He lost every single black precinct in the city, and people who lived across the street from him put big Bill Campbell billboards up. And he never recovered from that rejection by the black community that he thought had really understood him, nurtured him, loved him, and supported him. And I think that again talks and speaks to the power of the love for Atlanta, for Maynard Jackson. Look, I have lived an incredible life. When I tell you that I have prayed with Mother Teresa and counseled with Nelson Mandela and had worshiping with Billy Graham and Bishop Tutu, I regarded as a close friend. Andy Young, John Lewis have been mentors of mine. But the person that I found the most fascinating was Maynard Jackson, because he embodied this incredible spirit of eloquence and persuasiveness and a uniquely personal touch that I found so extraordinary. To be in Maynard's presence was to be in the presence of greatness, but it was also a very personal experience. I never went out with Maynard that he didn't shake hands with every single person that he encountered. And he always made them all feel as though they were extraordinarily special when they had that one moment. And you could see busboys and waiters just really rise up and be swell with emotion because he gave them the same personal touch as he did the president of Coca-Cola. And I think that gift is something that I learned from. I think it was his incredible, wonderful gift to all of us that made him the most extraordinary, most fascinating figure that I've known.
What advice did he give you when you won the election as first time as mayor? What sort of advice did he pass on to you that what would you have to deal with in your first 100 days in your first term?
Maynard and Andy Young, who were the two preceding mayors, were both wonderful to me in that they gave advice only when I asked for it. and they never offered any unsolicited advice. They were thoughtful, supportive, but never intrusive. And they gave me, a very young mayor, the opportunity to learn and make the mistakes that are inevitable, but also do it my way. And I appreciated him for that enormously. It would have been very easy for him to try to navigate me through the labyrinth of being mayor, but he was thoughtful enough to give me time to grow and develop on my own. And I think that also points to his maturity, his thoughtfulness, and his candor.
Where were you the day he died? When did you hear?
When Maynard left office, the first time in 1981, everyone was astounded that the business community rejected him and did not give him the kind of financial support that they had given to Sam Massell, who had been the mayor previously. No law firm offered him a partnership. No large firm put him on the board. All the things that you would expect of someone of his magnitude and who had performed magnificently well, brought Atlanta to a new level economically, socially, politically, culturally. There was not a single offer that he received. And he went to Chicago and joined a large law firm there, Chapman and Cutler. And then, in essence, was back and forth between Chicago and Atlanta. And everyone in the black community understood what that rejection meant to Atlanta and to Maynard Jackson. So when he left office the last time, he was in the investment banking business. And again, the ease of making Maynard successful with bond deals should have been second nature to businesses and companies in Atlanta, those that had benefited from the incredible growth under his leadership. But there was very little of that. And so we made certain from the city of Atlanta that Maynard's firm was successful because he deserved it, and because his firm was a wonderful, vibrant, professionally run investment banking firm. So Maynard's largest deals, bond deals, came from the city of Atlanta, appropriately so. And I was delighted that that happened. But unfortunately, the business required him to travel to cities large and small, and he was living in airports and going from small cities to big cities and trying to make these pitches for bond deals. And unfortunately, his heart just gave out, and his cardiologist called me the moment that he collapsed in Washington, D.C., to tell me of Maynard's death. And it was one of the saddest moments of my life, because I knew that someone of his health issues, and someone who was really trying to carry the weight of the world around on his shoulders after already having a heart attack, was going to have great difficulty. So in some sense it was inevitable, but it was a very painful moment for me and for Atlanta.
You can go ahead.
I'm going to ask you about his legacy. What's that? Right?
It's the fan. It's the camera fan.
Fighting the life, huh, Henry?
Yes, sir.
As
2016, we have a new president, Donald J. Trump. Atlanta's still a vibrant, growing city. You're about to have a new mayor, new election next year. Tell us about Maynard's legacy. I mean, you guys, you were the third black mayor. The city has had black mayors since the last 40 years, right?
Correct.
So tell us his legacy.
Maynard Jackson's legacy is that he built a brave and wonderful city. Atlanta is like no other place for African Americans, and in fact, what we now see is that young people, the millennials, want to live in Atlanta because of the vibrancy and the diversity and the social justice and the culture of Atlanta. And that's all directly on a straight line from Maynard Jackson. The airport, which Maynard built, allows Atlanta to prosper economically. And it's the busiest airport in the world. And I would say that were you to ask Maynard Jackson, if we had the privilege of talking to him now, he would say that the Atlanta airport, which of course is named now for Maynard, that would be his greatest bricks and mortar achievement because, number one, as he used to say, it was built on budget and on time. But beyond that, it created this economic powerhouse that has allowed Atlanta to continue to grow and prosper, and he built it with substantial minority business participation. Maynard Jackson used to say when he was building this new airport against the wishes of the establishment, tumbleweeds will roll across the runway if we don't have minority participation in the building of this airport. Tumbleweeds will roll across the runway. Now, the airport was already very successful even at that point, but he was willing to risk his entire legacy on making certain that economic participation for minorities and women was a part of the growth and development of the airport. That is an unbelievably courageous and historic achievement that is remarkable because there's so much of his entire political life that he was putting on the line to make a statement about what was right in society. And when you think about how few political figures are ever willing to really take a risk of that magnitude, it just gives you a sense of the depth of Maynard Holbrook Jackson. So everything about modern Atlanta is a direct result of what Maynard created. Affirmative action programs in contracting businesses, a legacy of inclusion and diversity, a vibrant city culturally. He was so far ahead of his time in creating the Bureau of Cultural Affairs back in 1973 and made it a real part of what he wanted Atlanta to be, a culturally rich city with diversity. And I just can't find anybody in urban America who has ever been as responsible for the creation of a modern city as Maynard Jackson was and is to Atlanta.
Great answer. I mean, he came along at the same time as Thomas Bradley and Coleman Young and Richard Hatcher, but these are the ones whose name that keeps.
Now look, there was a time in America's history, not distant history, where virtually every major city in America had a black mayor. Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, Denver, Houston, Dallas, Kansas City, Newark, Gary, Indiana. You could go down the line and list virtually every single major city in America. And although many of them were successful in some ways, none had the enduring legacy that Maynard Jackson had for Atlanta. And his legacy continues to stand in a way that is, I think, a real tribute to a great man who created a great city and gave his life for it.
Good. That was good. Good. Let's get room tone. Very good.
Room tone for Bill Campbell interview.
Good. Thanks, Bill.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So with